The wind carried the aroma of grilled meat and maneuvered dry leaves in front of that imposing restaurant. Behind the glass wall, executives conversed among silver cutlery and hushed laughter. Outside, a man with calloused hands and dignity in his gaze held the brim of his worn baseball cap. "If I sweep the floor, can I earn a plate of food?" he asked the security guard. At that moment, from the other side of the glass, the restaurant owner looked up. What no one knew was that the panhandler was his own father, and that this encounter would forever change both their destinies. Before we delve into this story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The wind blew gently and sharply that winter morning, as if in a hurry, but with no destination. It raised dust from the sidewalk in small whirlwinds in front of Donatello's restaurant, one of the most exclusive in the city. The outdoor tables, arranged with military elegance under stylish awnings, reflected the shy glow of the sun struggling against stubborn clouds. Some hurried executives already occupied their seats, making lunch an extension of the office, while waiters in impeccable vests glided among them with the precision of a dance rehearsed for years. Anthony stood across the street, observing that world that seemed to exist in a dimension parallel to his own. He ran a hand over his face, marked by 6 decades of life, most of them hard labor, and adjusted his threadbare coat that no longer offered the same protection. His deep brown eyes, which still held a youthful sparkle, scanned every detail of the place. The spotless windows, the fresh flower arrangements, the satisfied-looking customers. There was something hypnotic about all that abundance, like a movie in a language he didn't fully comprehend. He crossed the street with slow but determined steps. Hunger was nothing new to him, but the idea he had just conceived was. In his 68 years, he had never asked for food. He had always worked, always managed to get by, even when his back started protesting and construction jobs became scarce. But now, after 3 days without a decent meal, his bones felt like they weighed tons inside his thin body. When he reached the main door, he felt the stares. The security guard, a young man in a dark uniform and rigid posture, observed him with that mix of suspicion and pity that Anthony knew well. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture as best he could, and approached. "Good morning, young man," he said in a serene voice, trying to maintain the dignity he still possessed. "Would it be possible for me to speak with the manager?" The security guard raised an eyebrow, surprised by the formality. Homeless people usually asked for spare change or leftovers, not audiences. "The manager is busy. If you want to leave a resume, you can hand it in at the reception desk." Anthony smiled gently, as if the young man had said something amusing. "I'm not looking for a permanent job. I just wanted to propose a service." "What kind of service?" "Sweep the sidewalk, clean the windows, anything you need." He paused and added, "In exchange for a plate of food, that's all." The security guard looked around, uncomfortable. "Sir, you're blocking the entrance. Please step aside." But there was something in the man's dignity that prevented him from being harsher. Anthony didn't move away, nor did he insist. He just stood there with the same serenity, as if he had all the time in the world. "I don't want charity, just a quick job in exchange for lunch." His voice remained calm, without the desperation that usually accompanied such requests. The employee hesitated, unsure how to respond. He had encountered many panhandlers, but few who offered to work. There was something different about this man, a calmness that was more unsettling than an insistent demand. Meanwhile, on the other side of the glass wall, at a table near the window, Edward Miller observed the scene with growing interest. A custom-tailored Italian suit, a Swiss watch worth more than a modest car, perfectly trimmed grey hair, every detail of his appearance communicated success and control. He was the owner of Donatello's and 3 other equally exclusive establishments in the city. Something about that old man at the door caught his attention, but he couldn't quite say what. Perhaps it was his dignified posture, or the way he remained serene despite the security guard's rejection. Edward took another sip of his perfect coffee, prepared exactly as he liked it. He was there for his weekly meeting with his executive manager, reviewing numbers, marketing strategies, possible expansions. He shouldn't be distracted by a panhandler at the door, but he couldn't take his eyes off the scene. His cell phone rang, and Edward answered automatically. It was his assistant, reminding him of an investor meeting at 2 o'clock. He confirmed his presence, hung up, but his eyes returned to the door. There was something familiar about that man. Raphael, the manager, approached with a folder of reports. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. I've prepared the numbers you requested regarding the expansion." Edward made a discreet gesture toward the door. "Is that man bothering the customers?" Raphael looked over his shoulder. "Oh, him. He just arrived. He's offering to sweep the sidewalk in exchange for food. I've already asked the security guard to send him away. And why is he still there? He's polite, not aggressive, just persistent." Raphael shrugged. "Do you want me to ask him to leave myself?" Edward thought for a moment, watching the old man who now took off his worn cap and ran a hand through his thinning grey hair. "No," he finally replied. "Let him clean the sidewalk, give him a plate and send him off before anyone complains." Raphael seemed surprised. Edward wasn't known for his generosity with strangers, but he didn't question it. Simply nodded and left to relay the orders. Outside, Anthony received the news with a discreet smile. The security guard, still uncomfortable, handed him a broom and pointed to the area that needed to be cleaned. "Thank you, son," Anthony said, accepting the broom with an almost solemn gesture. He began to sweep slowly, with a care that seemed disproportionate to the task. It wasn't just a job in exchange for food. It was an affirmation of dignity. Every methodical movement, every small pile of leaves he formed, had the precision of someone who would never allow need to rob him of his pride. Edward watched, now openly, ignoring the papers Raphael had left on the table. There was something in the way the man worked that felt like a physical memory, a déjà vu he felt in his muscles, not just his mind. The way he held the broom, the slight tilt of his head when he concentrated, even the rhythm of his movements. The discomfort grew in his chest. He took another sip of coffee, but the drink now tasted bitter. Some customers also observed, with that mix of curiosity and discomfort that privileged people feel when confronted with poverty, they prefer to ignore. An elegant lady murmured something to her friend, both shaking their heads in a gesture that could be pity or disapproval. Anthony saw none of it. He was focused on his work, sweeping every inch with total attention, as if that sidewalk were the most important thing in the world at that moment. Raphael approached Edward again. "Sir, the reports." "Later," Edward interrupted him, without taking his eyes off the old man. "Raphael, does that gentleman out there seem familiar to you?" The manager, surprised by the question, looked more closely. "Now that you mention it, there's something about him that reminds me of you, you know. The way he moves, perhaps." Edward felt a chill down his spine. "What? Seriously? He could even be your father." Raphael laughed, unaware of the effect of his words. Edward felt his heart race. The air suddenly seemed thin. Memories he had buried under years of ambition and shame began to surface, like bubbles in boiling water. "It can't be," he murmured. He stood up abruptly, almost knocking over his cup. Raphael took a step back, confused by the reaction. "Are you all right, sir?" Edward didn't answer. He walked out through the side door, avoiding the main entrance where the old man was still sweeping. He needed air. He needed to think. Outside, he walked around the restaurant, keeping his distance. He observed the old man from another angle, now with painful clarity. The reality hit him like a punch to the gut. The man who was asking to sweep the floor in exchange for food was Anthony Miller, his father, whom he hadn't seen in almost 8 years. The man who had dedicated his life to building homes for others. The man who had raised a son alone after his wife's premature death. The man who had never complained about difficulties, who had never asked for anything beyond an occasional visit. The man whom Edward, in his social climbing, had gradually excluded from his life. First came the missed birthdays, then the Christmases spent with the excuse of business trips. Visits became phone calls became occasional messages. Until one day, when his father tried to visit him at the office, Edward asked his secretary to say he was in a meeting, and after that, there were no more attempts. The last address he had for his father was a small apartment in the suburbs. He sent money every month, an amount his conscience considered sufficient to assuage his guilt, but he had never checked if it actually arrived or if it was adequate. He had presumed his father was fine because it was more convenient to believe that, and now here he was, not as a ghost of his guilt, but as a real man, in flesh and blood, sweeping the sidewalk of his restaurant to earn a plate of food. Edward felt a sudden nausea. He leaned against the wall, breathing with difficulty. What would he do now? How would he face this situation? Shame and remorse mingled in his chest, creating an almost unbearable weight. Anthony finished sweeping. With careful gestures, he gathered the last small piles of leaves and dust, making sure no residue remained on the sidewalk. He leaned the broom against the wall, took off his cap again, and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He smiled at the security guard, who now watched him with reluctant respect. "Thank you, young man. It's all clean now." Edward gathered his courage and approached, each step seeming harder than the last. The physical distance between them was small, just a few feet, but the chasm he had dug between their lives seemed insurmountable now. His father saw him approaching, but showed no surprise. There was a serenity in his gaze that Edward couldn't comprehend. How could someone in his situation seem so at peace? "Good morning, young man. It's all clean. Can I have a plate of food now?" His voice was the same as always, the same timbre, the same cadence, the same slight rural accent that Edward had tried to eliminate from his own speech. The words caught in Edward's throat. The reality of the situation hit him in successive waves. His father, the man who had taught him about honor and work, was there, asking for food in exchange for a service. And worse, he hadn't recognized him. Or was he pretending not to recognize him? "Dad." The word came out almost as a whisper. The silence that followed was dense, almost palpable. The city noise seemed to disappear, as if the world had paused to witness that reunion. Anthony looked up, studying the face of the man in front of him with more attention. A glimmer of recognition passed through his eyes. "My son," he finally said, and a tired smile formed on his lips. "It's been so long since I saw you. You look different." Edward felt the weight of curious employees' stares, of customers discreetly observing the scene. His carefully constructed life, his meticulously crafted image, everything seemed to be crumbling. But at the same time, something within him, something that had long been dormant, was awakening. "Why didn't you look for me?" The question escaped before he could contain it. "I did look," his father replied simply. "But your office receptionist always said you were in a meeting, and I learned not to insist where I'm not welcome." The impact of those simple words was devastating. Edward lowered his eyes, unable to meet his father's gaze. There was no accusation in his voice, only observation, and that made everything even worse. Anthony, perceiving his son's embarrassment, changed the subject with the generosity that had always characterized him. "I didn't come to ask for anything. I just thought if I swept the floor, maybe I deserved lunch. Nothing fairer than that." Edward looked at the impeccably clean sidewalk. His father had always been like that, meticulous, dedicated, performing every task, no matter how simple, with excellence. "You didn't need to sweep anything, Dad, but I needed to do something. Work is still what makes me feel alive." A waiter, oblivious to the drama unfolding, rushed out with a steaming plate and placed it on an outdoor table. "You can eat right here, sir," he said, unsure exactly whom he was addressing. Anthony thanked him with a nod and sat down. He broke the bread that accompanied the dish with his hands, with slow and precise gestures. Edward remained standing, motionless, torn between paralyzing shame and the urge to sit beside his father. "Want to share?" Anthony asked, offering half the bread. That simple, memory-laden phrase pierced Edward like an electric current. It was the same question his father used to ask when, in harder times, they shared the little they had. On nights of scarcity, Anthony always broke the last piece of bread in half, always offered the larger part to his son, always asked with the same generous naturalness, "Want to share?" Edward sat down, overcome by that memory. For a few seconds, the world around them seemed to disappear. Only the distant city noise filled the space between them. "I failed you, Dad." Anthony looked at his son, his eyes full of an understanding that went beyond resentment or bitterness. "No, my son, you just forgot where you came from, but the way back always exists." At that moment, something broke inside Edward. Tears, held back by years of self-control and appearances, began to fall silently. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried, and now he was doing it in front of the crowded restaurant, under the curious gaze of employees and customers. His father said nothing. He just watched, giving his son the time he needed. Then he placed his wrinkled hand on the table, near his son's hand, without touching it. A gesture that was both an offer of comfort and a respect for the distance Edward had created. "I didn't raise you to be rich. I raised you to be good, and there's still time for that." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a truth Edward had tried to ignore for years. All his success, all his achievements, all the money he had accumulated, none of it meant anything if he had lost the essence of what his father had taught him. Edward took a deep breath, as if he could expel years of misguided decisions with that exhale. He looked up, meeting his father's patient gaze, and felt something shift inside him. He called Raphael, who was observing the scene from a distance, and when the manager approached, he said with a calm that surprised himself, "All of this restaurant, this name, this brilliance, none of it makes sense if my father has to ask for food at the door." The words hung in the air, full of a meaning that went beyond that moment. Raphael simply nodded, unsure what to say. "What do you want me to do?" Edward looked at his father, then at the restaurant, and something crystallized in his mind. A decision that had been born not just of guilt or shame, but of a renewed understanding of what truly mattered. "Many things will change starting today, Raphael. Many things." That afternoon, Donatello's illuminated sign was turned off for a few minutes. When it lit up again, it bore a small phrase beneath the restaurant's name: "Here, no one leaves hungry." It was just the beginning. In the following weeks, the restaurant, once known only for its exclusivity and high prices, began serving free meals every afternoon to homeless individuals. There were no grand announcements, no marketing campaigns exploiting the initiative. Just a silent and profound change, like the reunion that had inspired it. Edward renovated the small apartment where his father lived and offered for him to move into his house. But Anthony refused, with the same serene dignity that had always characterized him. "Thank you, son, but I prefer my own little place. And now that you know where I am, you can stop by for dinner once in a while." And Edward started doing that. At first out of obligation, then out of habit, and finally out of genuine pleasure. He rediscovered the father he had left behind in his race for success, and with him, parts of himself he had forgotten. Anthony continued to visit the restaurant, no longer as a panhandler, but as a special presence, respected by everyone. He used to sweep the floor before each social lunch, insisting that it was his way of contributing. Edward, after initial attempts to stop him, understood that this was important to his father, the dignity of work, the value of contributing, the honor of being useful. They never openly spoke about that first reunion again. They didn't need to. True forgiveness had manifested not in words, but in actions, in changes, in their presence in each other's lives. And every afternoon, before the restaurant opened its doors to serve the free meals, his father would clean the floor, look at his son and say with a smile that lit up the entire room, "Now, my son, it's ready to receive real people." And Edward knew, in the depths of his transformed heart, that those words contained the most important truth he had ever learned. The morning Anthony asked to sweep the floor in exchange for food changed not only his life and Edward's, but hundreds of other people's. The small gesture of dignity rippled out like a stone dropped into a calm lake, touching lives in ever-widening circles. Agnes Stone, a 70-year-old woman who had long slept in shelters, was one of the first to experience the restaurant's new policy. At first, she entered hesitantly, clutching her worn purse to her chest as if expecting to be thrown out at any moment, but she was greeted with genuine smiles and a comfortable seat. When the plate arrived, the same served to paying customers, presented with the same elegance. Silent tears streamed down her wrinkled face. "It's been 40 years since anyone served me like a person," she whispered to Anthony, who now accompanied the social meals, chatting with the guests, making them feel at home. Edward observed these interactions from his office on the mezzanine through a discreet window. He saw how his father, even without formal hospitality training, intuitively understood what those people truly needed. Not just food, but dignity. Not just charity, but respect. Raphael, initially skeptical of the change, was surprised to find that the restaurant hadn't lost its traditional clientele. On the contrary, the story of Anthony and Edward, even without intentional publicity, spread throughout the city. New customers began to arrive, attracted not only by the excellence of the food, but by that silent philosophy that transformed a commercial act into something greater. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. In the third week after the change, when the news had already spread among the homeless population, a considerable line formed at the door. Some of Edward's partners, concerned about the establishment's image and rising costs, called an extraordinary meeting. "This is madness, Edward," said Mark Peterson, one of the oldest investors, pounding his hand on the mahogany conference table. "We understand your charitable moment, but this is getting out of control. We're losing regular customers, scared off by the line of homeless people at the door." Edward listened to each argument calmly. When everyone finished speaking, he stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the street. "Have you ever really looked at them?" he asked without turning around. "Not as homeless people, not as a problem, not as statistics, but as people." An uncomfortable silence fell in the room. Edward continued. "My father, yes, the gentleman who now helps serve the tables, taught me something a long time ago that I had forgotten. True wealth lies in what you give, not what you accumulate." He turned to face his partners. "I'm not asking you to agree. I'm communicating a decision. This restaurant will continue to feed those who are hungry. If anyone wants to sell their share, I will buy it immediately, without negotiation." That same evening, when he shared what had happened with Anthony during one of the dinners that were now a weekly routine, his father listened in silence. "You know I'm willing to help, but I don't want to cause problems for your business, son." Edward smiled, pouring a little more wine into his father's glass. A simple wine, not from the expensive bottles he used to show off, but which now seemed like empty showmanship. "It's not a problem, Dad. It's a solution for something I didn't even know I needed to solve." A month after the reunion, Edward received Helen, the receptionist who had, following his orders, prevented his father's visits in his office. The young woman entered nervously, certain she would be fired after Edward discovered what had happened. "Please, Mr. Miller, I was just following instructions. You said you didn't want to be disturbed and—" Edward raised his hand, interrupting her. "I didn't call you here to reprimand you, Helen. On the contrary, I want to thank you." "Thank you?" She looked confused. "Yes, you followed my instructions, which were wrong. And now I want you to follow new instructions, which I hope will be more sensible. From today on, I want you to identify anyone who genuinely needs help when they come in. I'm not talking about automated donations or distant charity. I want to hear stories. Understand real needs." The receptionist's face lit up. "Like your father, Mr. Anthony?" Edward nodded. "Exactly. Like him." Donatello's initiative began to inspire other establishments, first on the same street, then in the neighborhood, and soon in other areas of the city. They weren't exact copies. Each place found its own way to contribute. A coffee shop began offering free breakfast. A bakery donated unsold products at the end of the day. A market set aside food close to its expiration date, but still perfectly consumable. Small gestures that, added together, began to weave a network of concrete solidarity. Edward discovered that his father, even without formal education, had a natural talent for identifying genuine needs. He invited him to help structure the social initiatives that were now multiplying. "I don't know anything about businesses, son," Anthony protested, embarrassed by the invitation. "But you know people, Dad. And in the end, that's what it's all about." On a rainy June afternoon, Edward received an unexpected call. It was Lisa Morrison, a journalist from a major national news outlet, wanting to do a story about the restaurant's initiative. "We're not interested in publicity," he replied politely. "It's not publicity, Mr. Miller. It's inspiration. What you're doing. People need to know, so others can follow your example." After some hesitation, Edward agreed to the interview, with one condition, that his father be the protagonist of the story. The report, when published, bore as its title a phrase Anthony had said during the conversation: "The most dangerous hunger is not that of the stomach, it's that of dignity." The impact was greater than they expected. Letters and emails arrived from all over the country, people telling their own stories of reunion, forgiveness, second chances, business owners asking how they could implement similar initiatives, young people offering to volunteer. Something was changing, not only in the lives of Edward and Anthony, not only in the restaurant, but in a continuously expanding circle. On a particularly busy afternoon, when the line for free meals stretched around the block, Edward noticed a man in a suit observing everything from a distance. He recognized him immediately. Charles Davis, his main competitor, owner of a chain of luxury restaurants that always sought to surpass Donatello's in exclusivity and sophistication. Edward approached, extending his hand. "Did you come to see if the rumors are true, Charles?" His competitor shook his hand, an enigmatic smile on his face. "Actually, I came to understand. It doesn't make commercial sense, Edward. You're investing money in people who will never be your customers." Edward watched his father, who at that moment was helping an elderly woman settle at a table. "Perhaps the sense isn't commercial. Then what is it? Philanthropy? Social marketing? What return do you expect?" Edward thought for a moment. "Dignity," he finally replied. "For them and for me." Charles studied him for a few seconds, as if trying to decipher an enigma. "You've changed, Edward. You used to be the most ruthless of us all." "Perhaps I've just found myself," he replied, as his gaze followed his father, who was now serving water to a newly arrived young man. A week later, to Edward's surprise, Charles's main restaurant also started a free meal program, at different times from Donatello's, thus complementing the offerings in the city. When Charles and Edward met at an industry event, they exchanged only a nod of recognition. They didn't need words. Something deeper was at play. Anthony's life also changed. Despite his son's insistence, he continued to live in his small apartment, but now renovated, comfortable, safe. He began to frequent not only Donatello's, but Edward's other restaurants, always as a discreet and respected presence. Sometimes he surprised everyone by sitting with important foreign clients, talking with his simple and direct wisdom, making them laugh with his construction stories, revealing human truths that transcended cultural and social barriers. "Your father is a remarkable man," a Japanese executive commented after one such conversation. "He understands people." Edward smiled, proud. He always understood. It just took me a long time to realize it. The reunion also revealed painful truths. In a sincere conversation, Edward discovered that the money he sent monthly had been discontinued for more than 2 years, when he changed accounting firms. No one had told him, and he, caught up in expansions and acquisitions, hadn't noticed. "Why didn't you look for me when the money stopped coming, Dad?" Anthony shrugged. "You had your life, son, and I always knew how to get by. But you ended up on the street." "For a while, yes, after I got sick and the medicines consumed my savings, but it wasn't so bad. I met good people. I learned important lessons." His father's serenity in facing difficulties was, for Edward, a constant lesson. There was no bitterness in Anthony, only a quiet acceptance of life as it presented itself, combined with a silent determination to maintain dignity regardless of the circumstances. On a cold August night, as they both watched the rain from the window of the closed restaurant, Edward asked the question that had tormented him since the reunion. "Have you forgiven me, Dad, truly?" Anthony contemplated the rain for a long moment. "Son, true forgiveness is like this rain. It doesn't ask if the ground deserves to be watered. It just falls." He turned to face Edward. There was nothing to forgive, because there was never any anger, only waiting. Edward felt his eyes fill with tears again. Even after months, he still got emotional easily, as if decades of repressed emotions now needed to find escape. "I never deserved you, Dad," Anthony smiled. "Love isn't about deserving, son. It's about giving." 6 months after the reunion, Donatello's had transformed. It remained a refined restaurant, with a loyal and growing clientele, but now it had a soul, an identity that went beyond gastronomy. The social meals, initially offered only twice a week, now took place daily. A team of social workers began working in conjunction, identifying among the attendees those who could benefit from employment opportunities. Some were hired by the restaurant itself, others referred to partner companies. One afternoon, Edward found his father conversing animatedly with a young man in his 20s who looked distinctly frail. "This is Matthew," Anthony introduced. "He was my sidewalk neighbor for a few weeks. He has a talent for drawing, look." The young man, embarrassed, showed a worn notebook with surprisingly good sketches, drawings of the city, portraits of people on the street, everyday scenes captured with sensitivity and technique. Edward examined the drawings with genuine interest. "Do you have an art background, Matthew?" 2 years of college, sir. Before." He let the sentence trail off. "Before life got complicated," Anthony completed, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder with paternal affection. The following week, Donatello's displayed a small exhibition on its walls, The Invisible City, with Matthew's drawings. The works were for sale, and the young man, initially disbelieving that anyone would be interested, saw all his works purchased in less than 15 days. "This is just the beginning," Edward said as he helped Matthew count the money from the sale. "You have a unique perspective." The young man, now staying in a guest house subsidized by the restaurant, looked at Edward and Anthony with tear-filled eyes. "Why? Why are you helping me?" It was Anthony who responded, "Because someone needs to remind people that everyone deserves a second chance, or a third." As the first year approached, Edward planned a special celebration. He didn't just want to mark the date of the reunion with his father, but also the birth of that new philosophy that had transformed not only the restaurant, but his own life. He decided that, on the anniversary of the day Anthony had asked to sweep the sidewalk, Donatello's would be exclusive to vulnerable individuals. A grand celebration, with the same refinement offered to the most affluent customers. When he shared the idea with his father, Anthony looked thoughtful. "Are you sure about this, son? It will attract attention. A lot of attention." Edward smiled. "Weren't you the one who always said that some things need to be done, not because they are convenient, but because they are right?" Anthony nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "So you actually paid attention to what I said. Every word, Dad, even when I pretended not to listen." The announcement of the celebration divided opinions. Loyal customers enthusiastically supported it. Critics questioned whether it was just a charity spectacle. The press was interested, wanting to cover the event. Edward refused all media requests. "It's not a publicity stunt. It's a private celebration with special guests." On the eve of the big day, as the final preparations were underway, Edward found his father sitting alone on the restaurant's patio, observing the street's activity with that contemplative serenity characteristic of him. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" Anthony smiled. "Circles, son. Circles. Yes. How life draws perfect circles, even when we think we're walking in a straight line." He made a gesture encompassing the illuminated restaurant. "Who would have thought that day, when I asked to sweep the floor, would bring us here?" Edward sat beside him, allowing himself a moment of reflection amidst the hustle and bustle of preparations. "You know, Dad, for years I thought success was measured by what one could accumulate: money, property, power." He paused, searching for the right words. "Now I understand that true success lies in what one can transform, in oneself, in others, in the world around us." Anthony nodded slowly. "It's a lesson many people only learn late. Some never learn." They remained silent for a few minutes, contemplating the sky gradually darkening over the city. Then, with a decisive movement, Edward stood up. "Tomorrow will be a big day, Dad. We'd better rest." Anthony also stood up, with that careful slowness of someone carrying 6 decades of life in their body. "You know what I like most about you, son, your ability to start over." The day of the celebration dawned sunny, as if the sky itself wanted to participate in the party. Donatello's facade was decorated with elegant simplicity. At the entrance, a new, permanent sign had been installed, replacing the provisional phrase. Now, beneath the restaurant's name, read in golden letters, "Dignity is priceless." The doors opened at 11 in the morning. Anthony was at the entrance, greeting each guest with a personalized handshake, a kind word, a recognition that went beyond formality. He knew most of them by name. People who, in other times, he had met on the streets, in shelters, in the forgotten corners of the city. Edward watched, marveling at the naturalness with which his father interacted with everyone. There was no condescension, no typical distance of institutional charity. There was genuine human connection. The restaurant quickly filled. 100 seats, 100 different stories, 100 lives marked by difficulties, but also by impressive resilience. The menu, prepared by the chef with the same care as always, was served by waiters who had been specially trained for the event. In the middle of the meal, Edward noticed something extraordinary. The atmosphere was not one of charity or welfare. It was one of authentic celebration, community, belonging. People conversed animatedly among themselves, exchanged stories, laughed. The restaurant, which had always been a space of exclusivity, had transformed into a place of genuine encounter. When dessert was served, Edward stood up discreetly and approached the small stage where the piano normally stood. He asked for everyone's attention with a gentle gesture. "I'm not good with speeches," he began, "but there's something I need to say today." He paused, searching for his father's gaze among the guests. Exactly 1 year ago, a man of unshakable dignity asked to sweep the floor of this restaurant in exchange for food. He didn't know that the owner was his own son, and the son, blinded by years of estrangement, almost didn't recognize his own father. The silence in the hall was absolute. Edward continued, "That man, my father, Anthony Miller, taught me more that day than I learned in years of business. He reminded me that a person's worth is not in what they possess, but in what they are, in the dignity they carry, regardless of circumstances." Edward extended his hand, inviting his father to join him. Anthony, visibly moved, stood up and walked to his son, his slow steps echoing in the attentive silence of the hall. This restaurant, which was once just a profitable business, gained a soul that day, and today we celebrate not only a personal reunion, but the birth of a simple idea, that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, always. He looked at his father, now by his side, and smiled. "Dad, thank you for sweeping not only the floor of this restaurant, but decades of mistakes from my life." Anthony, with tears in his eyes, hugged his son. The hall erupted in spontaneous applause, many guests also with watery eyes. When the applause ceased, it was Anthony who spoke, his voice clear and firm. "Life is like a construction. Sometimes we need to demolish to rebuild. And the foundation of everything is respect for the dignity of every human being." He looked around, at every face present. "All of you taught me that. On the sidewalks, in the shelters, in difficult moments. Never forget, no one is defined by circumstances, but by the dignity with which they face them." The event extended into the afternoon, transforming into a celebration of shared stories and new friendships formed. Edward and Anthony circulated among the guests, listening, conversing, connecting. At the end of the afternoon, when the last guest left, father and son stood alone in the now silent restaurant. Edward poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to Anthony. "To us, Dad. To new beginnings." Anthony raised his glass. "To life circles, son. To reunions that transform." They toasted in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts. Then, as had become a ritual since the reunion, they went out to the sidewalk together. Anthony picked up the broom that now had a special place in the restaurant, symbolizing that first encounter, and began to sweep with the same meticulous movements as always. Edward watched, feeling a deep gratitude for that second birth that destiny had granted him. Life had given him the rare chance to correct mistakes, to rebuild, to rediscover what was essential. As Anthony finished sweeping, the sun began to set, casting a golden light on the restaurant's facade. The letters of the new sign shone like a promise fulfilled. "Dignity is priceless." Anthony leaned the broom against the wall, contemplated the work done with satisfaction, and turned to his son. They didn't need words at that moment. The silence between them now was one of understanding, not of distance. With an almost ritualistic gesture, Anthony placed his hand on his son's shoulder and said, as he did every day, "Now, my son, it's ready to receive real people." And Edward knew, in the deepest part of his being, that those words contained all the wisdom he would ever need. From the downtown restaurant, the idea spread like a whisper, gaining strength until it became a collective voice. Other establishments adopted similar philosophies, each in their own way. A bakery began offering free breakfast. A hair salon dedicated one day a month to serving homeless individuals, restoring not only their appearance, but their self-esteem. A volunteer dental clinic began operating in the back of a church, restoring smiles long hidden by shame. Small gestures that, combined, began to redraw the face of the city. Edward expanded the initiative to his other restaurants, but with care that each unit developed its own identity. He didn't want to create a charity franchise, a term he detested, but rather a genuine philosophy that could be interpreted in different ways in each context. The work brought constant challenges. There were attempts to exploit the system by people who didn't truly need help. There were critics who saw the initiative only as social marketing. There was resistance from some employees who felt uncomfortable with the new clientele. Edward faced each obstacle with the serenity he had learned by observing his father. He was not shaken by criticism, nor was he flattered by praise. He had learned that true value lay in continuous work, in consistency, not in moments of public recognition. Anthony, in turn, became a well-known figure in the city. People stopped him on the street to talk, share stories, ask for advice. He received everyone with the same genuine attention, never allowing notoriety to affect his simplicity. One October afternoon, after the first anniversary of the reunion had passed, Edward was surprised by an unexpected visit to his office. Laura Thompson, the city's Secretary of Social Services, wanted to meet him personally. "The work you are doing is extraordinary, Mr. Miller," she said after the initial introductions, "and we would like to expand this model to other areas of the city." Edward listened carefully as she explained the proposal. A partnership between the public sector and private establishments, creating a more comprehensive support network for vulnerable individuals. "We wouldn't be starting from scratch," Laura continued. "You've already proven that it works. You've already built credibility. What I propose is a structured expansion." Edward reflected for a few moments. "You know, Laura, I believe the success of this initiative lies precisely in its voluntary and personal nature. It's not an institutional program. It's a genuine human connection." Laura nodded. "I understand your concern, but think of the reach we could have with structured support from the local government." "Let me talk to my father," Edward replied. "He has a wisdom about these things that I am still learning to appreciate." That night, while dining at Anthony's apartment, a routine Edward now valued deeply, they discussed Laura's proposal. His father listened attentively, chewing slowly, as he did when thinking deeply. "Son," he finally said, "expansion is good, but be careful with the bureaucratization of affection." Edward frowned. Intrigued. "What do you mean?" "When we over-institutionalize a good idea, it sometimes loses its soul. It becomes procedure, statistics, reports." Anthony took a little more of the salad Edward had brought from the restaurant. "What makes our work special is the face-to-face interaction, the handshake, the recognition of another's humanity. That doesn't scale easily." Edward smiled, marveling once again at his father's clear thinking. "So you think we should refuse?" "I didn't say that. I just suggest that any expansion maintains the heart of the idea. Dignity, not charity. Encounter, not welfare. Being, not just receiving." The following week, Edward presented Laura with a counter-proposal. Instead of a formal program, they would create a network of establishments committed to similar principles. Each would maintain its autonomy and identity, but they would share experiences, resources, and learnings. The public sector could support with infrastructure and dissemination, but without bureaucratizing or standardizing the initiatives. "We want to preserve the soul of the project," Edward explained, "the genuine human connection." Laura, a pragmatic but sensitive woman, understood the concern. "We can start this way and evaluate the results. The important thing is to expand the impact." Thus was born the Dignity Network, an informal alliance of establishments, organizations, and individuals committed to a more humane and respectful approach to social issues. Without rigid hierarchy, without a standardized logo, without mandatory procedures, just common principles and a commitment to treat every person with the dignity they deserve. The following year brought unforeseen challenges. An economic crisis hit the country, affecting primarily the most vulnerable. The number of people needing support increased dramatically. Testing the capacity and commitment of the newly formed network, Edward realized they needed to adapt quickly. He called a meeting with all network members, which now included more than 30 diverse establishments, restaurants, coffee shops, clinics, salons, markets, pharmacies. The meeting took place at Donatello's after closing hours. Anthony, as had become tradition, swept the floor before everyone arrived, preparing the space not only physically but symbolically. When everyone was seated, an eclectic mix of business owners, public officials, community leaders, and people who had benefited from the network and were now contributing to it, Edward took the floor. "The crisis we face is a test of our principles. It will be easy to revert to old models of impersonal charity when numbers grow. But our commitment is precisely the opposite. The greater the need, the more important it is to maintain a human perspective, the recognition of each person's individuality." There was a murmur of agreement, but also expressions of concern. How to maintain the quality of service when demand tripled. How to ensure that no one left without being served, without feeling they mattered. It was then that Matthew, the young artist who'd been one of the first beneficiaries of Donatello's initiative and now coordinated a cultural project within the network, stood up. "Can I share an idea?" Edward nodded, yielding him the floor. "The question is not just how to give more, but how to involve more people in the process of giving." Matthew looked around, seeking support in their gazes. "Many of us have been on the other side, receiving help, and the greatest dignity comes when we can also contribute in some way." A reflective silence filled the room. Matthew continued, "I propose that every person served by the network be invited, not obligated, invited to contribute in some way. Those with manual skills can help with repairs. Those who know how to cook can assist with meals. Those with artistic talent can beautify the spaces, not as a condition for receiving help, but as an opportunity for participation." The idea immediately resonated. It was the perfect expression of the philosophy they had tried to build from the beginning. Dignity through reciprocity, not dependence. Anthony, who had been listening in silence, slowly stood up. Everyone immediately paid attention. The respect for him transcended any formal hierarchy. "What hurts most about poverty is not material lack," he said, his clear voice filling the space. "It's invisibility. It's when people walk past you as if you don't exist. It's when they look at you, but don't see you." He paused, his eyes sweeping over each face in the room. "What this young man is proposing is not just work in exchange for help, it's recognition. It's saying, you matter, your skills matter, your contribution is valuable." He looked at his son, a serene smile on his face. "That's what I learned that morning, when I asked to sweep the floor. It wasn't just for the food. It was for the dignity of contributing, of doing something useful, of leaving my mark, even if it was just on a clean sidewalk." Matthew's proposal, named Reciprocal Dignity, was implemented throughout the network. Each establishment found ways to adapt the idea to its reality. At Donatello's, people served by the social program began helping in the urban garden installed on the rooftop, which now supplied fresh herbs for the kitchen. At the dental clinic, patients with administrative skills assisted in organizing appointments. At the bakery, a small, informal baking school was formed. The economic crisis, which had initially seemed like an obstacle, became the catalyst for an important evolution in the project. The Dignity Network not only survived the difficult period, but strengthened, expanded, and deepened its impact. On a spring afternoon, when the crisis finally began to abate, Edward found his father on the restaurant's patio, observing the street's activity with that contemplative serenity that characterized him. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" Anthony smiled. "Life's surprises, son." He made a sweeping gesture, indicating the bustling street, the restaurant, the city around them. Who would have thought that an old man asking to sweep a sidewalk would unleash all of this? Edward sat beside him, allowing himself a moment of contemplation amidst the day's hustle. "You know what impresses me most, Dad? How something so simple, treating people with dignity, can be so transformative." Anthony nodded. "It's because we forget that simplicity. We complicate everything with rules, procedures, systems, and we forget that in the end what everyone seeks is to be seen, to be recognized, to be valued for who they are." They remained silent for a few minutes, watching people come and go on the sidewalk. Then, with a slow but decided movement, Anthony stood up. "It's time for my sweeping," he said, with a smile that lit up his tired eyes. Edward protested, as he always did. "Dad, you don't need to do that anymore. We have staff for it now." But Anthony was already picking up the broom, that same broom from the first day, now kept in a special holder near the entrance, almost like a ritual object. "I don't do it because I have to, son. I do it because I want to, because it reminds me of where we came from and what really matters." And he began to sweep with the same meticulous movements as always, while the afternoon sun cast a golden light on the sidewalk, on the restaurant, on the city that little by little was learning a simple but profound lesson about dignity and recognition. Edward watched, feeling a gratitude that words could not contain, for everything he had lost and found again, for everything he had learned, for all the lives they had touched, and that had touched them. When Anthony finished, he leaned on the broom for a moment, contemplating the work done. Then he turned to his son and said, as he did every day, "Now, my son, it's ready to receive real people." And Edward knew, in the deepest part of his being, that those words contained all the wisdom he would ever need. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.